Hello, and welcome to the third week of our 8-week webinar series called Advancing in Predictive with Alteryx. Today, one of our senior consultants at Technion and Alteryx ACE, Deanna Sanchez, will be covering data prep and blending. Kind of before we get started, here's an overview of the upcoming weeks and their webinar topics that we have left. So we'll be covering k-means, fuzzy matching, decision tree, crosstab and transpose, and time series. And all of these webinars will be on Thursdays at 12 p.m. A few notes before we get started. Yes, this webinar is being recorded and the link will be available before the end of the week. And we will have a Q&A session at the end, but feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A panel as we go along. And a little bit of some introductions. My name is Rachel Mason, and I'm the marketing specialist here at Technion Data Solutions, helping facilitate this series, and Technion is happy to be hosting this series. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Deanna.
Excellent, and thank you very much, Rachel. I appreciate the introduction. And hello, everyone. It's great to be on this webinar in part of the Predictive series with Technion. And I'm very privileged to show you a lot today about data prep and blending. But as Rachel mentioned, I'm also very honored and privileged to be an Alteryx ACE, which is an Alteryx certified expert. And I also am very happy to say that I did win the Ace of Aces Award at the Alteryx Inspire conference a few months ago. Again, that was a great honor and totally unexpected on my part. So I was up against some very stiff competition with some other aces. I have been using Alteryx since 2005, way back when, definitely almost 15 years ago now. And my degree is in geography and geographical information systems. So I use Alteryx to specialize in spatial and demographic analytics. So anything that has to do with a map, I am very happy to work on, and some of you may know that already who've been on our other webinars. I'm also the author of Everything Happens Somewhere, which is an ebook and a GIS webinar series for Alteryx, and that can be found on the alteryx.com/resources page. I've also been co-leading the Dallas Alteryx user group for 5 years now. We are now over 360 members. So if you are in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, feel free to go to community.alteryx.com, user groups, and look for the Dallas user group, and you can sign up to join, and it's free to join. We do have monthly meetings. I also founded the Fort Worth Alteryx user group, and those alternate with the Dallas meetings as well. So today I'll show you about data prep and blending in Alteryx. And you can see here on the slide, data prep and blending is a portion of all that Alteryx can do, and it does it so well. So you're going to see just a bit of that today. 1 hour is not enough to show you all the data prep and blending you can do in Alteryx, but I'm certainly going to try. And this data prep and blending goes really hand in hand with the Predictive webinar series. It's so important to learn how to do data prep and blending and really get to know your data before you get into predictive analytics. So in this slide, you can see there's just a list of some of the things you can do in Alteryx. We're going to do a few of these today. But again, from sorting to joining to aggregating, there's lots of great formulae inside of the Alteryx formula tool. And you can parse, you can even do regex or regular expressions, rename columns, and again, much, much more. So the day is going to be just a brief overview into what data prep and blending can be. But a lot of the things I'll show you today are what you can use as you're getting your data ready for those predictive analytics. So with that, I'm going to switch over to my screen and show you Alteryx. So here I have Alteryx up and ready, and I'm going to show you some things about data prep and blending. So for those of you who are new to Alteryx, this is Alteryx. It's a really great interface. I've got a canvas here where I build my workflows. I have a configuration window that changes with every tool that I bring to the canvas. And then I have a results window here where I can not only see the results of the workflow, but I can also see the results of the data. And I can see it every step of the way in Alteryx. So one of the best things about Alteryx is transparency into your data. And you'll see that as I build these workflows today. You can actually see step by step exactly what's happening to the data per tool inside of the data. Also, I want to show you these great tools here. We've got our favorites tools, and I'll be using quite a few of these today, but we also have a wealth of tool sets available in Alteryx. So not only do we have in-out tools, but today I'll focus a lot on these wonderful preparation tools here. I'll use a little bit of the join tools, but in my later webinar in this series, I'll be getting deeper into these, especially the fuzzy match tool. We've got some parsing and transforming. The last part of the series for me, I'll be getting into transposing and cross-tabbing your data and a deeper dive into the summarize tool as well. So there's a lot of other options in Alteryx, as I mentioned. There's spatial, there's data investigation, there's the interface tools to make analytic apps for end users. And then you've seen with Kyle's presentations, the predictive tools and getting deeper into time series and so on. So as I mentioned, data prep and blending is really just a cornerstone of the foundation of what Alteryx really is. However, it is widely used for data prep and blending. So I'm going to start with a data set here. I'm going to pull in an input data tool. And as you can see, it is a drag and drop canvas. So as I pull these tools in, they're going to connect to each other and build that data stream, or what we call a workflow. So I'm going to navigate to a data file. As you can see here, I can also connect to SQL Server, Oracle, Hadoop, even other databases such as OLEDBs and ODBCs, and for you GIS people out there, even Esri geodatabases. So that's a conversation for another time, but feel free to reach out to me if you have questions on how to connect to Esri geodatabases or MapInfo tab files and other spatial data formats. So I'm going to open up a file here, and I'm going to just scroll down to a CSV file, and I've got one that is San Francisco data from 2013. So a CSV is really just a text file, just separated by commas. So a comma separated values here. And you can see here, I get a nice preview of the data when I first bring it in. So I've got an employee name, their job title, some pay information, including overtime and other pay, their total pay and benefits, a year, and a jurisdiction, which is San Francisco, hence the name of the file. So I can look at it here in this preview. But when you're first learning Alteryx, I highly recommend adding a browse tool, especially after every tool that you add to the canvas, just so you can see what's happening with your data and you can get used to viewing your data. So I've added a browse tool and I click run. So I run the workflow with this little run workflow button here in order to push the data through the stream and into the browse tool. So this allows me to really view my data. There's so many great things about the browse tool. It is no question why it is the #1 tool here in the favorites toolbar. So as I mentioned earlier, you get transparency into your data. This browse tool allows you to look into your data and see what's happening with it. So again, this is essential for your data prep and blending before doing predictive analytics. So with the browse tool, there's a lot of benefits. I could even do a whole webinar on just the browse tool, but I'll give you a quick overview here. So with the browse tool, I can click on any of the fields here and actually learn more about that. So here in the job title field, I can hover over it with an interactive chart. I can see information about the job titles. I can also see my data quality. So it says 100% of the data is okay. It's not empty or null or so on. And if I scroll down, I can learn more about my data. I can see my longest value, my shortest value. I can also see how many nulls there are or blanks and so on, how many unique records there are. So as I like to say, even with predictive analytics, spatial analytics, or any data analytics, It's very important to know your data before you get into the actual analytics side of it. So this way of looking at it through Alteryx really gives you that advantage of knowing your data. So I can look at the data and I can see also there's color coding here. So the green lets me know, even with a pop-up tip here, that the data is 100% okay and looking at the year, but notes has a yellow coloring. So it says 100% of those are null. So immediately I can kind of get a quick view and just know that, okay, notes has a lot of null values. That field is not populated. So again, a good quick overview to look at your data and learn about it. But I'm going to show you as we work along not only how to do your data prep and blending, but some tips and tricks that I've learned through these 14 years of using Alteryx. And I love tips and tricks, so I'll be showing you a few things that might be really useful to you and make it easier for you to use Alteryx as well. So a hint about tips and tricks, I am a right clicker, and if you right click in Alteryx, there's a lot of cool things that can happen. So I highly recommend right clicking on tools and seeing what you can do with them inside of Alteryx. So the first thing I'm going to do, and this is something that is important to me, this is actually my favorite tool, and it's in the preparation tool set. I'm going to use the autofill tool, and I love the autofill tool. It's great not only for setting your data types to the smallest possible size and also optimizing your data, and it works on string data, so that is something to keep in mind. It's not going to look at your numeric data, but it will work on your string data. But it also is a great tester, and I'll show you how that works. So when you're looking at your data, it's a good way to test and figure out things that you may not know just by looking here and hovering in your browse tool. So I'm going to bring the autofill tool to the canvas here and connect to this CSV. So something good to know about CSVs is they always come in as a V string size 254. It's just the way that it's set up with those text files that are comma separated. So the autofill tool is really useful to actually optimize that data. So you can see earlier I had pay fields and overtime pay and so on. But if I look at the data in the metadata format, and some of you who've been using Alteryx may not know about this little tip and trick here, I can actually in the browse tool click on metadata, and I can actually see my data types and the sizes. So instead of adding a select tool, which I'll show the newer users how to do in a moment, I can actually just click on metadata, and here are all my V-strings 254s. So if I want to do some calculations on my pay fields, such as summarizing the pay or aggregating the pay, I need to actually have these in a numeric format. When they're in a string or text format, it doesn't really make sense when you aggregate the data. It's actually just going to be text data. So we need to change that into a number. So instead of adding a select tool and clicking on each of these, I can add an autofill tool, and I can say, let's optimize all of these fields. I'm going to leave it at the default of all, and then I'm going to add a browse tool so you can see what happens to it. So I'm going to click run. The same number of records are coming through, but if I click on the browse tool and leave it on metadata here, now you can see my types have actually been optimized. Everything that is a numeric value has now been changed to a double size 8, which is really useful for me. So now I can do greater thans and less thans, I can summarize the data and so on, and create a total pay field and so on with this. So it even took my year field, which is really just 4 digits, and brought it down to an integer 16, size of 2. And then it found in the jurisdiction name, the longest string length is 13. So instead of that original 254, it brought it down to a size of 13. This is huge when you're working with millions of records of data. The autofill tool really does optimize that and bring that string length down to its widest width. As you can see here, employee name is 39 instead of 254, and so on. And that really does save you a lot of space and therefore a lot of time when you're processing your data. So that's a really quick tip and trick, is to use that autofill tool to optimize your data, especially if you're working with CSV files. It will recognize when something's a numeric format and optimize it to the best format for that numeric data, and so on. So I'll switch back to data view. So now you can actually see the data as well. And I'm also going to show some neat things about data cleansing. So we may have some values here. If I click on my base pay, I can actually see very quickly there are some null values here. So if I'm doing some calculations, I may want to impute those null values to 0. I may not want to leave them as null. Perhaps in my analysis, I prefer those values to be 0 instead. So with all of this null data, I can actually do something really cool. So it used to be in the old days, years ago in Alteryx, you had to add a formula tool, and then you set up a formula that's, or a conditional expression that said, excuse me, it's that time of year, I guess, in October. If you have null values, then make them 0, else make it the value end if. You'd have to set up this conditional expression. So now there's a really great tool that you can use instead, and it is the data cleansing tool, as pertaining to the title of this session. So the data cleansing tool is extremely useful. There's so much wrapped into it. I'm going to bring a data cleansing tool to the canvas. And I'm going to say, go ahead and we can clean all the fields. That's totally fine. And we're going to replace string fields that are null with blanks. And we're going to replace numeric fields that are null with 0. We can also remove leading and trailing white space, tabs, and so on, even punctuation, which I'll show you how that looks in a little while. You can even modify the case. So if I, for example, was getting this data ready for a fuzzy match coming up, where I needed to match names between two data sets, perhaps I should uppercase or lowercase all of those names in order to really make that match easy. I can actually do it here in the data cleansing tool. I don't have to add a formula tool to do that. It's actually embedded into this nice little macro, which is the data cleansing tool. So I'm going to say, let's replace all of those numeric fields that are null, replace them with 0 for that base pay field. And again, I'm going to add a browse tool, just for those who are new to Alteryx, get used to looking at the data. And now if I click on base pay, I now have 605 records that are now 0. So if I go back to that original, I can look at base pay. Using my hover, I can see there's 605 that were null. I've used the data cleansing tool, and now for my base pay, all of those have been imputed to 0. So that can be really useful as you're getting your data ready to go into those much more advanced predictive tools also. So the next thing I'm going to do is bring in another data set to the canvas and show you a tip and trick about the autofill tool and testing some data. So this time I'm going to go here back to that data set, and I'm going to bring in some county data. Again, this is CSV, but it's going to look pretty familiar. Employee name, job title, pay, and so on. And then it has it per county. So what I'm going to do here is actually look at the data and get to know it a little better. So just as we did before, add a browse tool. Now I can profile my data, I can look at the job titles and so on. If I hover, it says everything's okay about that base pay data. Very similar to the base pay that we were looking at before for San Francisco. But there's something else that I'm going to do. I'm going to make a test here with this autofill tool. So I'm going to bring the autofill tool in again. I'm going to do, let's change all the string fields because it is a CSV. And then I'm going to add a browse tool here. So I'll click run. And, I might look at all my base pay data and assume it's going to be numeric, right? Same for overtime and other pay. Just like in this data set, if I click on metadata, it should all be double. That's what we're thinking anyway. So if I go back to this data set here and look at base pay, and I switch to metadata, it's very interesting. the pay fields here, for some reason, are still string. So I need to start asking, well, why in the world are these string? These should all be changing into a numeric format. So I can actually go back to the data view and start asking questions. So in my data view, I'm going to click on base pay. Looks good, but if I hover, there is a text inside of this numeric data set, and the text is aggregate. So if I scroll down, I can look at the data. The longest value is not provided, so there's a field called not provided. There's some text in there. There's some text in there called aggregate. So this is not truly numeric data only. This actually has some text in there, and the autofill tool is great for figuring that out. Because if you simply looked at it here, you might say, oh, these are all numbers. I can start performing calculations. But if this is coming, say, from an Excel file and it's got some totals in there, and then there's some aggregates that are being put in there with a text, this is a good way to figure that out. So I'm looking at my data here. It's base pay, overtime, and so on. So I can actually do something about that. Maybe I'll just filter that data out of there. So I can just say, let's take the base pay, and we'll add a filter tool. So maybe we can say, all right, I don't want anything with aggregate in there. So I can say base pay does not equal, and then aggregate. So you notice if I use a basic filter here, it actually puts it into the right syntax for me down below. So it puts it in SQL or SQL, and I have brackets around my field name. I have the exclamation mark in front of the equals to signify not equals, and then the quotes around text, which is aggregate. So anytime you're using the basic filter, you don't have to put quotes around your text. It will do it for you. If you are doing a custom filter, you do have to type it properly. So that's just something to keep in mind there. I'm also going to show you a cool tip and trick. If you right-click, because as you heard, I like to right-click in Alteryx. If you right-click, you can add all browses. So if you also like hotkeys, you can do a Control-Shift-B. So that will add a browse right after. So I've just added browses to my true and my false output without having to click here and drag them in one at a time. And for those who like really uniformly spaced tools, this adds them nicely spaced and perfectly aligned. So again, highly recommend right-clicking. Right-click on a tool, you'll find all sorts of cool things that you can do. You can add all browses. If you like hotkeys, there is in the help files in Alteryx a list of hotkeys as well. So that does make using Alteryx a lot faster. I'm also going to show you another tip and trick. If I click here on the white space, I get to my workflow configuration. So this is the configuration for the entire workflow, and there's a lot of great options inside of here as well. But what I'm going to do is click on connection progress and change from show only when running to show. This way, I will actually see the number of records coming through at each point in the data stream and the size of the data coming through. This can be really useful with filters and so on, or the sample tool where you're expecting a certain number of records. Say you're looking for top 10, then you can see the number 10 come through here. So I'm going to click Run. And now you can see in this filter, about 5,000 of them were actually listed as aggregate. So if I click on the browse here, now you can see all of those base pay and the rest of the pay fields with the aggregate data in them. This was filtered on base pay does not, or here, equals aggregate for the false output. But since we did it not equal to aggregate, our true output actually has all base pay that does not equal aggregate. So that's a really quick and simple way of actually filtering out those string fields in the data. Then you can use either a select tool or an autofill tool to actually change the field type to what you would like it to be. So speaking of the select tool, there's also a good reason why this is in the favorites tool set as well. It is a fantastic tool, especially for those who are code writers. You'll find some great things inside of the select tool. So I'm going to bring select here. And I'm going to bring my true output here. This is my filtered data. And like I said, for those code writers, you can actually just simply change your data type by clicking the drop down. You don't have to write code anymore to change your data type. You also don't have to write code to change or rename a column. I can just click on rename and change it. So I'm going to change employee name to name, and this will persist all the way through the rest of my workflow. So it's a really nice feature to be able to click on these and change them and make them what I need them to be. So for this example, here's my base pay. I'm going to change that to a double. And a tip and trick for those Alteryx users, if I wanted to change them all, I can actually say, let's do overtime pay, hold down the Shift key, click on benefits, and I can force a change. So sorry about that. Click on this, hold down Shift, click on options. And there's a lot of nice things hidden inside of options. So I can do change field type of highlighted fields. I'm going to change it to a double. So if you've got, 50 or 100 different fields and you're trying to change the data type, you don't have to click on them one at a time and change the data type. You can actually use that technique of clicking on the first one, hold down Shift, click on the last one, and then Options, and change field type of highlighted fields. So again, a lot of things that are hidden inside of Alteryx. If you right click or if you click on the options, a lot of nice features inside of there. Also with Select, I can take out fields that I don't need. So this is another great feature of data prep and blending. Maybe I don't need those notes, and maybe I don't need the year because all of the data is from 2013. So I can simply uncheck those and remove them from the data stream. This also optimizes your data stream as well because you're removing data from it. So you're taking off data that's taking up space that you really don't need. So I've added that select tool, and maybe I want to find the top paid people. So you saw these salaries here, and as I like to say, these are California salaries. These are some California counties here. So some really good base pay there in those salaries. And I'm going to actually add a sort tool. So sort has a very simple configuration. You just simply sort on the field and in the order. So I'm going to say, let's give me the top paid person by base pay. And we're going to change it from ascending order to descending order. And then I can add a browse and click run. So now I'm going to see who's that top paid person according to base pay. So here it is. Now it's sorted, and according to the base pay here, it is an orthopedic surgeon. That does make sense in many ways. And so now I'm actually sorting this. So very quickly, what if I wanted the top 10 paid people in this data set on base pay? I can actually use a sample tool. So I'm going to bring a sample tool to the canvas. And sample has a lot of options. So I can say, give me the first n rows. I can skip some rows. I can do a percentage of rows, or even generate a 1 in n chance for the rows. But for now, I'm just going to give me the first n rows where n equals 10. And then I'll add a browse after that. So I'll click run. And now you can see, since I have in my workflow configuration, again, you get to that by clicking anywhere on your white space. If I have connection progress set to show, now you can see it's reduced from 380,500 down to 10. So this is a good way to kind of check your data as you're moving along. It's also a great way to see where your bottlenecks are happening and where you've got a lot of data that the process is churning through and maybe a huge file size. You can immediately see it based on setting your connection progress to show. So here in my browse tool, I can see my top 10. So another cool thing about the browse tool is I don't have to just scroll through down here. I can actually open a new window and look at all the records. So this is opening up a very small temp table that's being generated on my C local users area. And I'm simply using my laptop, of course, for this demo here. And I did want to add, you can see how fast Alteryx runs. I am simply using this on a very basic laptop. I don't have a souped-up machine at all. And you can see it's churning through over 300,000 records in just seconds. So Alteryx does run in virtual memory. It again is one of the best parts of Alteryx because it is blazingly fast. And so you can see it go through data very quickly using that virtual memory. And so back to the browse tool, now I can actually look at all my data. I can actually browse millions of records in the browse tool. I don't have to look at a subset of data. So there is a good way to do that as well. You can just look at your data here, but something else about the browse tool. I can copy my results to a clipboard. I can save straight from the browse tool. So if I wanted maybe the top 3 out of this subset, I can simply click on the record ID, which is an internal record ID here in Alteryx, and then I can click on whether to save all records or selected cells. So I can click on selected cells and immediately I have a save as dialog come up and I can save these files if I want to here. So I can just call that subset. There we go. And just save it as a CSV. So I can save immediately from my browse tool, which is really nice. If I wanted to use this data in another workflow, there's another cool thing I can do. So let me get maybe the top 5. I can click on copy to the clipboard. I'm going to say selected cells with headers. And then if I need to, I can start a new workflow. I can right click and paste. This inputs it as a text input tool, and there's my 5 records. I've got those immediately as a text input, and I can use this in another workflow. So again, that's just straight from the browse tool using copy results to the clipboard. So if you select something, you can copy all records with or without headers or selected cells with or without headers. So again, another cool tip and trick inside of learning how to prep and blend your data. So now you've seen quite a few of these tools here in this preparation tool set. So we did some prep on the data. We looked at the data, we looked at the data cleansing tool, which is really useful, filtering and so on. But I'm also going to show you something about the data cleansing tool. So data cleansing tool, again, will remove punctuation. So here I've got some data, and I will leave it up to you as the audience to discuss amongst yourselves. This is the top 10 inflation-adjusted films of the box office winners here. You can see Star Wars seems to have a recurring role here over and over again, and you all can discuss amongst yourselves which one really is the best one in your opinion. I am a Star Wars fan as well, but I have this box office data, and maybe I actually want to take this where it doesn't have the punctuation of the $ or the commas, and I want to actually use this data numerically so I can do greater thans and less thans and filters on these. So one thing that you had to do in the old days was use a formula tool, and you can use a trim left formula and take the $ off of the total box office field. I could then do a replace and replace all of the commas with nothing. So those double quotes mean replace with empty or nothing. And that's how you would set that up in the formula tool. I'll also go a little bit further into the formula tool in a moment, but that's how you could do it in the formula tool. But thanks to the data cleansing tool, I simply can choose to cleanse the total box office field, and then I can remove punctuation. So I'm going to run this really quickly, and you're going to see the results. So here, I've got total box office has been cleansed with the formulas, but I also have the very same result with the data cleansing tool. I simply pulled the cleansing tool in, clicked on punctuation, and now the punctuation is removed. So I'll also show you something cool about browsing. So I've mentioned using the browse tool often if you are new to Alteryx. Once you get really used to using the browse tool and looking at your data, there's something called browse anywhere. So browse anywhere is a really neat feature. Here you can see there's an input arrow and an output arrow of every single tool whenever I bring it to the canvas. Some tools like the browse tool will not have an output tool. They are an output in themselves, where in the case of the browse tool, it's creating a temp table. But if I click on the input tool here, or the input, I can actually see what happens before the tool. And then if I click on the output arrow, I can see what happens after the tool is applied. So I have options of looking before the tool and then after the tool. This is really useful. That way you're not adding these browse tools and you're saving a bit of space because browse tools do create small temp tables. So once you get really used to browsing your data, you can use this browse anywhere function, and the browse anywhere function is also available here. So you can see there's a little icon for input. If I click on this, I see before the tool is applied and output. I see what happens after the tool is applied. And again, these are in your results window. So I can just click between the two. So again, another really useful tip and trick here in Alteryx. So something else I'm going to show you is the ability to filter. So you can actually set up multiple filters inside of Alteryx. So here I've got some address data. You can see I've got a company name, some addresses here in Massachusetts, and a score for the company. So if I wanted to find where the city equals Agawam or Belchertown, and the score is between 25 and between 50, so greater than 25 and less than 50, I can set up multiple filters. So here in my filter, I did a custom filter with an OR statement. So filters are Boolean, so you can use and OR and have that true and false Boolean output as well. So I just set up the criteria where the city equals Agawam or city equals Belchertown. So just something to know when you're using filter tools and you're doing an and or an or. The and or statement has to have the field listed next. It should not be set up where city equals Agawam or Belchertown. You do have to specify the criteria of the field, what field equals that criteria. So in this case, I had to set the field city equal to the criteria or the field city equals the criteria. So just something to keep in mind when you're using those Boolean statements. Also, I can set up my score. So here I've filtered, and in the true output, I will open this in a new window so you can see it fully. Now it meets those first criteria of Agawam or Belchertown. So now I need to filter on the score and find those between 25 and 50. So out of my true output, I can add another filter where the score is greater than 25. And since it's a simple setup, I can just use a basic filter and it will put it into the syntax that is needed. So now I can actually look at my true output. 20 out of the 25 from the first filter meet that criteria. So I'm looking for scores greater than 25, and this definitely is correct. And then I can set up another filter of score is less than 50. So now I've got 9 out of the 20 that were true for score is greater than 25. Now I have 9 where the score is greater than or less than 50. So now I've set up this whole criteria of the city equals Agawam or Belchertown, and the score is between 25 and 50. Also, I can filter before any of my use of data into the predictive tool. I could set up a compound filter here. So I could do the very same thing. I can set up using those Boolean and or statements. So here again, you need to put the field that the criteria are based on, and you do it after the ands and the or statements. So the score is greater than 25 and the score is less than 50. This gives us that range in between. Another and statement, and then the city equals Agawam or the city equals Belchertown. So just good things to keep in mind when you're setting up compound filters, really testing those ands and those ors. Whenever I do a compound filter like this, I always do a chained filter as well, just to check my criteria and make sure that it is filtering the way I'm expecting it to, and that I'm using the proper and statement or a proper or statement. So here you can see I have 9 as my results for my compound filter, and these are the very same results as in the chained filter that I did above that. So another thing I can show you for data prep and blending is actually going back to this data and blending the data. So we can actually start a whole new data stream here instead. I don't have to start with this data here, but I'm going to bring in some data and I'm going to show you how a join works as well. So I'm going to bring in some customer data. And with the customers, I've got a CSV file here. And you can see here I've got a customer ID and a segment and so on, and responder, and their name and address and information. So first, to look at the data, sometimes you may want to actually aggregate the data. And a good way to aggregate data, well, there's actually two ways very quickly to look at unique values. And as I like to say in Alteryx, there's usually more than one way of doing the same thing in Alteryx. So one thing you can do if you want to find just those unique values of customer segment, you can use a unique tool on the customer segment and find them. But what if you need some additional data like the count of customers per customer segment? That's when you would actually use the wonderful Summarize tool. So I'm going to bring in a Summarize tool here. And Summarize is really great because you have lots of options based on the data type coming in. So here I've got customer segment, and I can actually group by, I can count, you can do a min and max. There's all sorts of numeric options here, finance options, even string and spatial options in this as well. So I'm going to note that the numeric options are grayed out because the data I'm looking at is a V-string. If I change some of that data, which I'm going to do with the sales data, to a numeric format, then these numeric options for aggregating and grouping will actually be available to me. But first I want to look at customer segments. So I'm going to do an add and then a group by. So anytime you use the Summarize tool, whatever field you click on is the field you're adding the action to. So you're adding the customer segment field here, clicking on add, and then deciding what action you're going to utilize. So I've got group by customer segment. I'm going to go ahead and click run without adding the browse tool, and I'm going to use that browse anywhere function just for practice. So I'm going to click on the output here, and here's my 4 customer segments. So it was that simple to actually aggregate and group my data. Maybe I need to actually utilize just the segment types in my predictive analytics, and this would be the best way to actually find those segments very quickly. Another thing about the Summarize tool is it only outputs the fields that you're performing actions on. So you can see here, all these fields here are not part of the output. Only the field that I'm performing an action on is actually being produced in the output. So that's just something to note when you do a Summarize tool. I'm also going to show you a tip and trick because now I want to change, I want to add some data actually, some transaction data, and then I'm going to add that into this data and join it. So the transactional data will allow me to look at the segment. So I'm going to bring in another input data tool. I'm going to go back to that data here and just pull in some transaction data here, which is an XML. So for those new to Alteryx, there are a lot of options for input data inside of Alteryx. You can see here, these are the data file types that you can bring into Alteryx through the input tool. You can also connect to an in-database tool, and the in-database tools, so connect tools, will allow you to actually connect straight into a database and perform queries, joins, filters, and so on inside of the database itself. So you're not limited just to these file types coming in. So I'm going to open the transactions.xml. You can see there's a customer ID here, and then I have a product, and then I have their sales and their order ID. So I want to join the product and the sales to my customer data here that has their name and their address and so on. So the best way to do that is to add a join tool. So I'm going to bring a join tool here, and I'm going to connect to the customer data here into the left input and the transactions into the right input. So with a join, this is what you would think of as a VLOOKUP in Excel, but here in Alteryx, it is much, much simpler. And so I love doing joins, or what you would call VLOOKUPs, here in Alteryx because I simply join on a key field. The key field doesn't even have to be named the same name. As long as I know that's the field I'm joining on, then I can join it, and I don't have to lock down any cells either. So no more dollar signs to lock cells with this. So on the left, for my customers.csv data, I'm going to choose customer ID from this data set. On the right, I'm going to choose customer ID, It is spelled a little differently with that underscore there, but I can still join on it. And in the join tool, I have what's going to join between the two data sets, or an inner join. And then I'm going to have a left unjoined and a right unjoined. For those people used to database joins, this is different than an outer join. So in an outer join, you would have also the inner join included. This, though, is a real benefit of the join tool here in Alteryx, where I can quickly see what didn't join between the two data sets. I also have an embedded select tool here inside of the join tool. So I'm going to uncheck the right customer ID because I already have it coming in on the left. So I'm going to right click here and add all browses and then click run. And because I have that show connection progress, I can quickly see how many of these transactions actually joined to the customer data. About 9,300 joined, but 83 of the transactions did not join. So again, here's that left or right unjoined. And a real benefit is I can just click on that browse tool and start asking questions. So I've got these customer IDs that didn't join into the customers.csv data, and maybe I can figure out maybe the ID is mistyped, maybe it needs a leading 0 or so on, and I can start researching why it wasn't a complete join. But here's my actually joined data. So now I've got my customer ID. You can see now those transactions that are multiple are joining now into the customer data. So I can do a many to one join, or even a many to many, or just a one-to-one join. So now you can see my segment here, and then I can see my sales for every transaction per customer. So now I've got the data joined with each other. So inside of this join, I actually want to look a little deeper into it. So maybe I want to say, give me the sales per customer segment. And a great thing to do is use that summarize tool. So I'm going to add a summarize tool here and connect to the J output, or joined output. And I want to say group by customer segment, and I want to do a count. So the customer ID is a unique ID here. And so I'm going to say, give me a count of customer IDs. So actually, let's look at customer IDs. Actually, let me go back to sales, because I do want to do that grouping of sales. And I want to show you something cool that I can do. There's, of course, more than one way to do this. I can actually insert a select tool here and change the sales type, because right now these are just string. And I can't really do a summarize or an aggregate on a string of data here for sales data. I could click on this and do a drop down and change it to double, but I'll show you a tip and trick. If you ever add a tool and you want to get rid of it but not mess up your connections, right click, delete, and connect around. And now here's your connection intact. So here, I'm actually going to scroll down and change sales here to a double. So this option here that I'm outputting with this embedded select, this is changing the type going out of the join tool. So something to keep in mind, it doesn't change the type going in, it's changing my type going out. So now my sales will be a double. So going back to the summarize tool, now I've got sales as a double. I can do an add, and I can do a sum. So before I changed that to a double, sum was not an option because it was not numeric. But now I can do a sum of sales. I'm also going to change the name. I'm going to say sales per segment. There we go. And now with my browse tool, I can just quickly see per segment and then the sales per segment. So now I've got these 4 segments and then the sales per segment. So what if I want to actually do a calculation of percentage? And I want to say, what's the percentage of sales per segment based on the total sales overall? So to do that, I would add another summarize tool here, connect to the join tool, and then I would just scroll down and do sales and sum. I'm going to call this one total sales. And now I'm going to have an output of total sales. So to actually add this, I'll show you a really cool tool. So now I've just got total overall sales. I want to actually append this to my sales per segment, and I want to append it per row so that I can set up a formula to calculate percentage. So speaking of append, the right tool to use is the append fields tool. So I'm going to bring in an append fields tool, and there is a T for the target input and an S for source. So I'm appending the source to the target. So something I always keep in mind is I'm appending the smaller data set to the larger data set. So S is for smaller, S is for source. So that's how I always remember it. So here, if I look at the configuration, I'm going to append total sales to every record for customer segment and sales per segment. And I'll add a browse so you can see easily in a table what that looks like. So now I've got this output here, and now I've got total sales appended to my sales per segment. Now I can set up a formula calculation. So here's a formula tool, and I can create a new column by simply clicking Add Column after selecting the column, and I'm going to call it percent. And then I'm going to set up using my existing fields. So the X button here is your columns and constants. And I'm going to set up sales per segment divided by total sales. It's that simple. I may also want to make it in more of a percentage view for me. So I'm going to times that by 100. And Alteryx does work on the order of operations. So it's performing the division first before the multiplication here in order. And you can get a data preview. This is going to show you what the first record is going to look like in your data stream. And maybe I want to change the way that looks. I'm going to change it from a V string here to a fixed decimal. I now have a precision of 19 with a scale of 6. So I'm going to change my scale to 2 so that it has 2 decimal places. So the scale is actually the number of digits after your decimal. The precision is actually your entire number, not only including the numbers before the decimal point and the numbers after the decimal point, but your decimal point as well, and any negative signs if you have data with negative information. So it's important to keep in mind your precision is not the numbers to the left of the decimal point, it's the entire number plus any negative signs. So you have to keep a space for that as well. So I'm going to make it a scale of 2 to have a fixed decimal here. And then I'm going to add a browse. And it's churning through the data. And now I have my percent in a 2 decimal place format. And I've calculated the percent of the sales per segment out of the total sales. So I know we're coming up close on time. So I had a few other things to say quickly about the formula tool. When you have time, look at the formula and just go ahead and click through these. There's a lot of options inside of the formula tool, and these are all embedded formula for you to use. So you can change your date formats and so on. Some of my favorites are the string ones, where you can actually do the left characters of a string. You can pad left, you even have some embedded regex. And then also, you can actually get into substring and trimming in uppercase. So those are a lot of options inside of the FX or functions button inside of your formula tool. So I did want to open it up for questions. And also, if I don't have time to answer everyone's questions today, please send them to us through the chat, and then I will answer those offline later. So again, I will open it up for questions and pass it back over to Rachel.
Sure. So our first question is, will the tool that optimizes the data change date and time to just show date?
That's a very good question, and in fact, no, it does not actually. It looks at string and it changes them over to the string function or the optimized to the date function, but if it is date time and you want to make it simply a date, I highly recommend using the datetime tool inside of the parse tools. So if you want to take off those hours, minutes, and seconds from your date and change it back over to a true date, use the datetime parse tool, and you can actually change it to really a lot of options inside of your date types. So you can even make it a format of month, day, and year with a slash, or you can do day, month, year with dashes and so on. So this is a great tool. I highly recommend using that.
Sure. Our next question is, what regex would you use if you want to filter words in caps letters?
That's a very good question as well. So we do have some embedded formula, as I showed you for the regex or regex, but we do have a regex tool. So I highly recommend getting inside of the regex tool, and there's been a lot of debate on how you can say it, but a lot of people, including the ACEs, have agreed you can say it both ways. So here I have a field I can parse of employee name. We don't have time to jump deep into regex today, but if you click on this little drop-down arrow, it actually gives you a lot of hints about how you would actually set up your regex. So for the person who asked this question, I can put a regex together and send it to you offline of how you would do that with uppercase. But we do have here for uppercase letters, and you can also switch that over to lowercase and so on. So there's a lot of options here inside of the regular expression or the regex tool.
Another question is, would there be any performance benefit with the precision and scale settings to change precision to your max, such as 5 or 6 for percentages?
Yes, I think that actually does help, especially if you have millions of records that you're churning through. Precision really is more of a placeholder, for those large amounts of data, say if you do go above 6 decimal digits to the left of your decimal and so on. But I think there is some optimization that can happen with very large data sets by changing your precision. And of course, I would only use the precision aspect if I really am specifying a fixed decimal in that. Otherwise, I would probably recommend a double or a float, depending on the type of decimal data you're using. Float is great for floating point decimal data, such as latitude and longitude, where your decimals may not be a uniform amount of numbers. But then double is simply a double precision floating point. So hopefully that answers your question. If not, I can also go deeper into the differences offline. But again, if you do have millions of records, you might experiment with changing your precision down to that maximum level.
So I think we only have time for one more question. Would find and replace be the best tool to normalize common abbreviations?
Let's see. So common abbreviations, kind of like states, like the two-digit TX for Texas, as opposed to the state name. You can definitely do a find and replace on that, or I would recommend maybe even a lookup table and doing it that way. If you actually use a lookup table and say for Alabama, use AL, but find and replace is also a really good tool for that, and that is in your join category. And find replace is also, you can set it to be not case sensitive. So that is something different than a join. A join is case sensitive, but find and replace has a nice secret option where you can make it case insensitive or case sensitive. So that's another benefit of that tool.
Great. Well, I think that's all the questions or all the time we have for questions now. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and thank you, Deanna, for a great webinar. Next week, we will be covering k-means, and feel free, if you guys have any other questions, to reach out to us on our social media platforms. Again, this webinar was recorded today, and the link will be shared before the end of the week. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. Look forward to talking with you again in a few weeks.